Now let's move on to why we are all here. Dr. Tamara Schur has been in the field of clinical psychology for over 25 years, in clinical practice as well as in various leadership positions. She has served as a director of clinical training, vice president for research, chief research strategist, and is now part of the core faculty in the Master of Science in Marriage and Family Therapy program at Northwestern University. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to you, Tammy. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and thanks for everyone for tuning in.
It's my pleasure. Can you all hear me, Cassie? Am I coming through loud and clear?
You are coming through loud and clear.
Good, good, good. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I see you're from all over, from the yucky Midwest weather to hopefully beautiful California weather and Tulsa weather, maybe somewhere in between. So welcome. I'm talking about one of my favorite topics today, which is how to be sick in the context of a marriage and keep everything in terms of your marriage intact, and how to be the spouse of a person who is sick in a marriage. Tech people talk about disruptors in various fields. So Uber was a disruptor in the taxi cab field. Casper was a disruptor in the mattress field. I understand that most mattress stores are now closing because of online mattresses. Having a chronic illness, think diabetes, heart disease, cancer, is definitely a disruptor in a couple's life. There is no way to look, I can't sugarcoat it in any way. There is no way to look at a chronic illness other than a stressor. And the stressor that affects the person with the illness, that I'll be referring to as the patient, the spouse or the partner of the patient is affected, and clearly the relationship is affected. What I think about a lot and what I work with is that illness, though it exists in a person, it exists in a relationship and in a family, it exists in a broader context. So it exists in the context of a marriage or a family, and there's no telling when it's going to disrupt. So it can disrupt the family, it can disrupt the couple at a smooth time for them. It can disrupt the family at a bumpy time for them. It can disrupt a dysfunctional relationship. It can affect and disrupt a functional relationship. So it exists in the context that it finds itself. It also exists within a context of other relationships. And each person in each context will have different reactions or responses. So illness exists in the context of work for many people. It exists in the context of an immediate family who you live with. For some people, it exists in the context of extended family for some people. It exists in the context with friends, and it exists at different points along the lifespan. I'll be spending a little bit of time talking about differences, but primarily what I'm going to do today is give you insight into how a relationship affects a couple and some tips for navigating that. My own research looks not only at how a relationship affects a couple, but how couple functioning affects a relationship. And I'm only going to spend a little bit of time on that today, unless you guys have specific questions about it. We can't always tell who is sick and who is healthy. This statistic of nearly 1 in 2 Americans have a chronic illness, I think, is a very jarring one. By 2020, about 157 million Americans will have some type of chronic illness. So we know that there are many of us who are sick, and many of us who will live with this condition probably forever, for the rest of their lives. And many more of us will be living with chronic health conditions. And when I say living with, I mean in themselves or in someone that they live with. But many more of us will be affected by this as our society trends older. What this means is that it's very likely that you, your partner, or both of you will be diagnosed with a chronic condition at some point and will have to adjust to living with it, whether or not you're the patient or the partner. So here are the top 10 chronic diseases in the United States and the percentage of people living with them. So chronic illness is everything from high blood pressure to sleep disorders to heart disease to depression to diabetes. And these are just the top conditions. I want you to note as you look at this list, I want you to think about a really important fact. This isn't the important fact that I'm a psychologist, but I'm a psychologist, and what I see in all of these conditions is that every single one of them has a behavioral component. And in fact, I don't have a slide for this, but what we die of today is much more. There are much more behavioral components to what we die of, whether it's heart disease or cancer or diabetes. There's a behavioral component that's implicated in how we die in the United States, much more so in the past. In the past, we tended to die of infectious disease, where there really wasn't a behavioral component. So as a health psychologist, a psychologist that works with the medically ill, I think a lot about not only what these chronic diseases are, but the behavioral component of them. And what this means is that at least some portion, and I will emphasize some portion, at least some portion of these conditions is accounted for by lifestyle choice. Lifestyle choice including how you eat, what your activity level is, how you take care of yourself generally. This includes, when we look at those chronic conditions, this includes depression that responds favorably to exercise. When I work with people who are depressed, I say this often, which is activity is the enemy of depression. So there is something that we can choose to do that can improve or not improve conditions like depression. Diabetes can be controlled by better diet and better exercise. And heart disease, all of those things, how you take your medication, how you exercise, what you eat, not just your calories, but what you choose to eat in terms of fat content. So there is a lifestyle component to all of this, but also note that lifestyle choice is only one factor in the many variables determining who gets sick with what. And some people, I think, don't acknowledge the behavioral component and the choice, the lifestyle choice in these illnesses. And some people go absolutely the other way and think that they are responsible for their own illnesses because they made poor choices. So take heart disease. I work with heart disease a lot. And in heart disease, someone can believe that they brought this on themselves, but they're not taking into account things like genetic, things like environmental influences, things like age, things like gender. So again, there is a lifestyle choice, a behavioral component to all of these, but it's not the only component. And a behavioral component in these diseases, I think, is both good and bad news. It's good in that we have some control over our own conditions. It's bad in that we don't have control over our partner's conditions and our partner's choices. And this, if anyone has lived with this and trying to change somebody else's behavior, this can be maddening, frustrating, anxiety provoking. So again, it's good news in that we have control, some control over our own illness and health, and it's bad in that we have less control, maybe minimal control in our partner's health and illnesses. If you look at this chart, this is just another way of looking at how chronic disease affects us and affects the people we live with. This chart tells us that only 35% adults are not dealing with a chronic illness. They're not dealing with the chronic illness in themselves or other people. And what's important to me about this is that this is across the entire adult lifespan. This isn't just about what's happening to older adults. It's important to consider that the impact of an illness is very different when it affects a young couple and a young person than when it affects an older couple or an older person. A young person, first of all, it's much less expected if they get diagnosed with a chronic illness. Second of all, a young person is living, I talked about context, a young person is living in a context where they probably are dealing with their own children, maybe their own parents at the same time, that they're sort of being sandwiched between those different levels of responsibility, and disease could hit them then, meaning it's even more of a disruptor for them than it might be for somebody who is older. And the other thing that occurred to me when my grandfather died. My grandmother, they were both living in a retirement community. And when he died and I was there with my grandmother for the funeral, I noticed how all of her friends sprang into action. Some brought food, some did the laundry, some just kept her company, some said they would stay overnight. Others knew exactly when to touch her and when to give her time by herself. When a young person gets sick, their social relationships, their social life doesn't know these rules. They haven't had a lot of experience dealing with illness in one of their own, in a contemporary, in a peer. So sometimes when a younger person gets sick or a sickness affects a younger couple, they feel more lonely than they would if it affects an older couple. But regardless of age, it tends to impact illness, tends to impact the relationship in similar ways, whether that's for a young person or an old person. And that's what I'm going to focus on. So a number of years ago, I was really interested in this idea of what it's like to live with someone with a chronic disease and what it's like to be that person, a patient with a chronic disease living in a marriage. So we conducted focus groups. We chose cardiac patients and their spouses for our focus groups. I think cardiac disease is a good example of a chronic illness. It's a good example because there's a big behavioral component. There's also other aspects, like I talked about before. There's a genetic component, and there's an age component, and a gender component. And heart disease, especially for men, this is actually not true for women, but heart disease for men tends to affect them young enough where they are likely to still have a partner. For women, actually, it affects them older when they are less likely to have a partner. So we conducted focus groups of women alone, and these women were both patients and partners with heart disease. We conducted other groups with men alone, again, men as the patients and men as the partners, and we conducted couples groups because I wanted to know how people talk differently in a group of just women or a group of just men or with their own partner present. And again, we asked lots of questions about their own experiences. What did they think about? What did they experience? What were the stressors? What was it like to be the patient or be the partner in the context of a relationship? So here's what we learned. The patients talked first and foremost about the feeling of dependency on their partner. And interestingly, that wasn't news to me. What was news to me is for some people, that dependency felt good. We heard things like, I've taken care of others my whole life, and it sort of feels good to be taken care of myself. For other people, the dependency felt awful. It felt like a burden on other people. They connected it with powerlessness. We heard things like, how can I make my own decisions for myself when I need my partner to help me with all aspects of this disease? That dependency also was connected with guilt. Like I said before, with the example of, I did this to our family. I brought this heart disease on us because of my choices of what I ate or how much I exercised, and I feel terrible about it. Or guilt in terms of, I can't believe that this is happening to me, and because of it, I'm putting my spouse through all of this. They understood the financial burden that a disease can cause. They understood the caretaker burden that a disease can cause and the effect of being a caretaker for somebody who's sick, not just for a short period of time, but for a long period of time, and maybe for the rest of their lives. And they also understood what we would call the role overload burden. The idea of when somebody is sick, the caretaker takes on the role not just of caretaker, but sometimes they're also taking on the role of the person who earns the money, or the person who stays in touch with family, or the person who buys the birthday gifts, or the person who cleans the house. And the caretaker gets all of those things in order, as a result of taking care of somebody with an illness. So we call that role overload burden. And the patient is very aware of this. They're aware of what they are not doing anymore. So here's what the partner says. I like this cartoon because it suggests that doctors should spend time talking about caregivers as well, and giving caregivers advice as well as giving patients advice. But anyway, what the partner says. It's a little bit more complicated to understand how partners go through this process. They are both sympathetic and blaming. They say things like, I feel terrible for her, but leading such a sedentary life, or by sitting out in the sun when people told her to put on sunscreen, or by not wearing a helmet when she rode her bicycle. They feel guilty for any stress they may have caused that led to this condition. So do you think that my husband has heart disease because I'm such a complainer and I always see the negative side of things when he's tried to see the positive side of things? Could I have caused this heart disease in him? So they're misattributing the impact of the stress on whatever condition that they have, while they're de-emphasizing the effect of these other things and taking that very much to heart. They feel guilty, the partners, they feel guilty for their thoughts when somebody they love is suffering, not just for things that they did or didn't do, or things that they're currently doing or not doing, but guilty for their thoughts. Their thoughts like, I hate this. Their thoughts of, and this is a big one, their thoughts of, what about me? Can I dare be so selfish as to say, what about me? But who takes care of me while I take care of her? Their thoughts of anger. I've been telling him for years to put on sunscreen. Their thoughts of, what if I don't want to be put in this role? Do I get any choice in this? So there's a lot of guilt, both for what's happening and for their thoughts. And the partner talks about the changes that are necessary now, the changes of the household, the changes in their relationship as a result of this illness, and talk about not liking them. So I mentioned this before, but things that change are things like, who's the person who earns the income and who stays home? I've seen couples that they have had to completely reverse this when one person gets sick and is no longer able to work. They talk about role overload. So one person becomes the mom, the caretaker, the worker, and the daughter and daughter-in-law. And they talk about financial concerns that this brings on them. We know about healthcare in America. We know about how expensive it is. We know about the idea of missing work or the idea of having to leave work. And it can change the financial stability of a family. And the caretaker is very aware of this and sometimes is quite resentful, but feels guilty about even saying those things. So we talked about the effects of the patient. We talked about the effects on the partner. We also question people on what is the effect on your relationship that this illness caused. So first, people talked about a really broad category, a category that when people come to see me as a couples therapist, that they talk about probably first and foremost, and this is in sick couples and not in sick couples, but they talked about communication issues. They talked about things like, it's really hard to talk about regular things when somebody that you love is suffering. So for example, how do I talk about the stress I just went through at the grocery store when somebody I love is in pain? Or how do I complain about how this is affecting me, the caretaker, when this person that I love is in bed or in the hospital? And can I even say these things to this sick person and put even more burden on them? And what about the old issues in your marriage? At the beginning, I talked about that illness is a disruptor and it can come into a marriage at the best time of a marriage or at the worst time of our marriage or somewhere in between. But no question, it can highlight, it can shine a spotlight on issues that have always been in the marriage. So not only are people then dealing with chronic illness, but they're dealing with their own and their relationship chronic issues. because when those issues don't go away. And how do you respond to the issues when somebody is sick? Can you respond to the issues when somebody is sick? So I edited a book a long time ago, and the book was for American Psychological Association. And the title I came up with, but I'm a boring academic, but the title I came up with was The Psychology of Couples and Illness. And we were right about to go to press, and the editor came back and said, we don't like the title. We want, and I'll never forget this word, we want something zippier. So I thought, I don't do zippy. I don't know zippy. I sort of write for other academics. I'm not even sure what zippy means. So I questioned my colleagues, and I said, I need a better title. And people gave me different titles, but my very favorite title was, honey, I'm sorry you have breast cancer, but your mother's still a bitch. And by the way, the book ended up The Psychology of Couples and Illness. I think that one was too zippy for the publisher. But I love that title. I love it because it highlights both of those things. It highlights the old issue, my problems with your mother, and it highlights the sympathy of, yeah, I'm really sorry, and I feel terrible that you're going through this. And it also highlights that the partner's feelings. So I love that title, but it didn't go anywhere. In terms of other communication issues, how do you tell your caretaker, if you're the patient, how do you tell your caretaker that you want a different kind of care or a different amount of care? So for example, how do you tell the person who is worried about you that you want to be left alone more, that you feel like they're hovering? Or how do you tell them you don't like the extra attention that you're giving? So one of these couples that was in this focus group, the wife was the patient. And she had a heart attack when her husband was like gone for a short amount of time, gone for the day, or gone to run an errand. But he wasn't home when she had a heart attack. He came back and ambulances were there, etc. And I think that he carried with him both the guilt that he wasn't there when she had her heart attack, but also this, what I would call this magical thinking, that if he is with her now, always, this won't happen again, that somehow he could prevent it. So what he was doing was, as she was recuperating, and even as she was feeling much better and trying to get on with her life, he was following her everywhere. She said, he follows me room to room. He follows me. I can't do any errands without him. And she said, I finally lost it when he followed me into the toilet. So again, only wanting the best. This isn't somebody who wants, something negative for their spouse. And by the way, that comes up too, but only wanting the best. And how do you say this to someone that you know is operating from a place of love and care and concern, that you don't like the way they are interacting with you? The other thing that people talked about was how illness, the word I would use is upends, how it upends everyday assumptions, everyday habits. Sometimes these are spoken and sometimes these are unspoken in terms of who does what in a family, who does what chores, who cooks, who cleans up, who takes out the garbage, who makes the kids' plans. I really encourage couples I work with to talk about those things so they're not just assumed or assumed incorrectly or assumed where there's resentment. But once you sort of have it figured out, whether it's overtly or covertly understood within a family, an illness changes all of that. In all of those that you did, chores, communication with outsiders, communication with family, the house, things that you do out of the house, who makes the social plans, who's the empathic one, and who's the problem solver. So all of these ways of working with each other gets called into question when somebody is sick. And that taxes an already taxed system. So illness is hard. All the changes that you have to make harder. And for me, when people don't talk about those changes, that's hardest of all. So the other way that people talked about the effect on their relationship. This isn't their terms, this is my term, is that the world can get very small after an illness. It gets small for the sick person, and it gets small for the people who love them, where they don't go out much anymore. They don't get together with friends as much anymore. They have less contact with their family. And if you think about the world getting smaller, you can also think about the strain that would add to your relationship. If you're really the only person that your sick spouse talks to, depends on, vents to, you can imagine how taxing that is on the relationship, where the social needs of the person, the patient, used to be distributed across lots of different systems. It was distributed at work, it was distributed with their family, it was distributed with their friends, it was distributed with their cousin. The caretaker didn't have to own it all. They didn't have to hold it all. So again, as the world gets smaller for the patient, sometimes and often for the caretaker, there's more strain on the relationship. So let's get practical. What can be done? What can be done by the patient? People sort of forget this part of the equation, but I'm a big believer in asking for what you want. I say this a lot to my healthy couples. I say this a lot to my sick couples. I say this a lot to patients, and I say it a lot to partners. Ask for what you want and be specific about it. For example, I would like you to check on me occasionally, but I most of the day so I can relax, so I can sleep, so I'm not interrupted. Or I'd like you to allow me to eat with the family instead of in bed, even though I know that's harder on everyone. Or I know I have a finite amount of energy in a day, but I'd like more say into how that energy is spent, even if what I choose to do you think is unimportant. And let me give you an example that made me think about that and made me validate what these people were saying. So this was a couple, and the wife had multiple sclerosis. She had MS. MS is a horrible disease. It's also a very unpredictable disease, and that if you have the relapsing and remitting type of MS, sometimes you can be sick in wheelchair, and sometimes you can be and act and seem just fine. So it's confusing. It's confusing for the patient. When will I be sick? It's confusing for the partner. When will they be sick? And there's a lot we don't know about it. But one of the things we know about MS is that fatigue makes it worse. So if they're in a relapse, fatigue will make the relapse worse. If they're not in a relapse, if they're in a remission phase, if they get tired, they can bring on a relapse. So fatigue makes it worse. So this woman said, and I think she said it quite poignantly, she said, at the end of the day, I know I only have so much energy left. I've been to work, I've worked with the kids, I've been there for you, and I know I only have so much left of energy at the end of the day. And energy is super important for me to conserve. And she said, and we get into fights about that. She said, I want to be the one to make the decision on if I clean up the dishes after dinner or if I choose to make love to my husband. And I know he gets a say in it. I know he wants a choice in it, but I want to be able to say that too. And sometimes making love with my husband will come first, but sometimes the dishes come first. And my husband doesn't seem to understand that I want a sense of accomplishment in my house. I want a sense of I can do the dishes, and when I come down in the morning, I'll have a clean kitchen. So other things in terms of asking for what you want. I'd like to keep my mother in the loop in terms of what we find out from the doctors and how I'm feeling. Can you take care of this? So ask for what you want. The other thing, wait, I'm sorry you guys can't see me. I'm taking a drink of water, so 1 second. The other thing for the patient to do is to tell your partner how you feel and don't forget the positives. Sometimes we think, even me as a healthcare provider, sometimes we think in terms of generalities. When this person is sick, here's what they like. When I'm sick, here's what I like. And those generalities don't really apply. We sometimes also think that someone that we've lived with for a long time should know how we want to be treated when we're sick, should know what our wants are and what our needs are, and we don't have to say them. With a chronic illness, that's just not true. Things change day to day, things change within the day, things change within the course of the illness. And I really tell patients to make it clear how they feel at any one time, at any one day. And this is a key that I've been talking a lot about lately, not to forget the positives. So in terms of how they feel physically, today's a rough day and I'm really low on energy. Or I'm feeling good right now. Is there anything, a small task that I can do to take off your list? I tell people to check in with their partners, the patients, emotionally. Things like, I'm scared, or I'm trying not to focus on what could happen with this, or I feel so bad for you, or I feel so bad for me. Those are not assumed emotions. I really believe those should be stated explicitly by the patient so that the partner knows what they're going through. It will increase the partner's empathy. I think that the patient should ask questions of the partner. So, how would you feel if I skipped Andy's ballet recital today? And wait for an honest answer from that. Or what do you need in terms of support? This is probably the hardest thing to talk about, but I encourage patients, and you'll see I encourage partners the same way, not to avoid the hard stuff. Because if one of you is worrying about something dark, one of the terrible outcomes that could happen as a result of your disease, I think it's better to speak up about it rather than hold it yourself and feel like you have to deal with it yourself. First of all, it's likely that the other person has thought of it too. The conversations can go to a dark place, but they can also make you feel closer to each other. If you are holding these things in and being more protective, you might become more distant from your partner the more that you try to hold in, or the more that they pick up on something is happening here that I'm not understanding and you aren't saying. So just holding in those concerns about the dark places can keep you more distant from your spouse, which may be the exact opposite of what you want. So I don't think that people need to deal with those things alone. So have these conversations like, if something happens to me, I really want our kids to continue in parochial school, or I want to be cremated, or find somebody to spend the rest of your life with if something happens to me. I don't know if any of you saw the TED Talk or read the New York Times article about the woman who was a journalist who wrote a letter to the future spouse of her husband when she was dying. But it was this hard conversation. Or, please take me off life support if there's no hope. I don't want to be on life support. So again, trying to have these dark conversations. Finally, I tell patients to show up as often as possible. They're sometimes going to feel way too sick to be present in any way. But when they're feeling a little better, show up emotionally. Show up in terms of physically showing up, attendance at things. Show up in terms of easing the burden. Show up in terms of being empathic to the other person. How was your day today? Including, I know you hate going to the grocery store. You were just at the grocery store. How was it? Again, inviting the things that some people are saying, I don't know that I can talk about when somebody is sick. Now, what's a partner to do? Very similar guidelines here. Ask questions and make them specific. Like, when you don't feel like talking, or when you don't feel like going out, or when you don't feel like being with the kids, or when you don't feel like eating, should I push you? Or, given my limited time right now with all that I have to do, is there something that I'm doing or not doing that you would like to be different? Or, can I ask your mother to come over and let me get out for a while? So ask questions, make them specific. Just like with the patient, ask for what you want. I'd like you to come to the dinner table as often as possible, even though I know it's easier for you to eat in bed. Or it would be a lot easier on me if you let your sister take on the responsibilities of communicating with your extended family and let me off the hook for that. That puts a lot of pressure on me right now. Or I'd like you to set up a web page and manage it to let people in our extended network know how you're feeling, how you're doing, what the doctor says. Ask for help from friends. People at all ages want to be helpful and they want to be given jobs. So they might not know how to ask. They might say, call me if I can do anything, or just let me know what I can do. And I would say take them up on that. Being a caretaker is hard. This might be for the long term. So take them up on, you know what, I don't actually need anything, in terms of our household from you, but I'd love you to call me and make me go out for a drink with you. Or when you go to the grocery store, just give me a call because sometimes I might want to go with you. Or can I take your cleaning lady for an afternoon? So again, ask your friends. They want to be helpful. Ask your family. People forget the family is suffering too, but they also want to feel needed. I've heard of lots of mothers of sick adults, grandparents of sick adults, brothers and sisters of sick adults saying, I feel shut out. And I understand that this couple has a lot going on, but I want to be there and I want to help. So let them, give them a task. And ask for help from the patient. The patient can take on things. Maybe not everything, maybe very different from what they used to do, but they can take on things to help. Be as honest as possible. Say things like, I hate this, or this is hard on me, or I never liked the caretaking role and I've never been good at it, and now it's all that I do. Or I won't run away, but I need to have a better diagnosis, and I want you to go to a specialist. What the answers that we've gotten so far aren't enough for me. And again, for the partner, just like for the patient, don't avoid the hard stuff. How do I access our money if you are unable to do so? I had a woman come to me whose husband had just died. They were an older couple, a fairly traditional couple. And she said, I don't know where any of our money is. I don't know if we have a savings account. She said, I know how to write a check, but I don't know if we have a savings account. I don't know if we have investment accounts. My husband just took care of this, and I don't know how to access it right now. Other hard questions. Do you want to talk about a funeral and your wishes? How do you want me to talk about the kids, about this very bad news we got today? Or we've never really talked about organ transplantation. How do you feel about it? Again, really hard questions, but sometimes they can be the best, the most intimate, and the closest conversations. So this next slide is about not just when somebody is sick, but it's about when someone has to make behavior changes because they're sick and how the spouse can help. So I'm going to go through it really quickly because I want to leave room and time for questions. But if you have ever tried to get your partner to change a behavior, to eat better, to exercise more, to wear sunscreen, I bet you have at the best had mixed results, but more typically, I bet you've had no results. It just doesn't work. There's lots of ways that you can help. You can help as a cheerleader. Way to go. Good for you. Yay, 4 walks this week. You can help as doing it with them. You know what? We'll all change our eating habits. And you can help by staying out of it. If you want to go to the gym on your own and you don't want me to check up on you, I get that. So there's different ways that you can help, and there isn't a right way. Research shows us there isn't a right way to do it, but talk about it. What is the best way that I can help you? We do know what doesn't work. Nagging someone to make changes doesn't work. Nagging sounds like this. Did you take your medicine? I need you to take your medicine. Here's your orange juice. Make sure you take your orange juice with your medicine. I put your medicine right next to your bed. Make sure that you take it. That's nagging. Nagging doesn't work. Policing doesn't work. That sounds like this. When I left home, there were 32 cookies. I got home and there were only 18. Tell me what happened. So that just makes someone feel guilty, bad, infantilized. So there's lots of things that do work in terms of behavior change, but nagging and policing are examples of things that don't work. Okay. So finally, going back to the title, who is sick and who is tired when there is someone with a chronic illness in a family? Everybody in a family is affected by an illness in one person, and everybody has to remember that. Both people will feel all emotions at one time or another. Both people should expect it. That's true whether or not you're the patient or the partner. This can be a time that divides you because of the stress it puts on you, but it can also be a time that brings you together because you're having intimate conversations, because you don't take your time together for granted. So it isn't all the negative. Some positives can come from it as you discover that you can be there for each other, as you discover that you can open up about your emotions. So, Cassie, that's all I've got. I'm happy to take questions.
Great. Tammy, thank you so much for sharing all of this really helpful information. And I'd love to get started talking about one of the topics you mentioned just recently in the presentation around not avoiding the hard stuff and talking about end of life decisions. When do you recommend that folks have these conversations? And can you give us some advice around how to best tackle that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because I think that people don't know. So I've worked with couples where one person has said, I really want to have one of these conversations, like about a funeral, but I don't want him to think that I gave up hope. And then he, the patient, said, I really want to talk to my wife about what I want to do in this situation, but I don't want to make her think that I'm only thinking about death. So I'm going to go back to my old standby, which is ask for what you want. And I think you can ask. I've got a lot of concerns and a lot of worries, and sometimes these worries take me to a really dark place. Are you up for talking about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe scheduling that time or making them aware that you want to talk about it before going right into the topic.
Yeah, give them some preparation. You've been thinking about it for a while. Give them some preparation. And if they say absolutely not, there's no way I'm going there, that's true for now, but it doesn't mean it's true for always.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great point. Really great advice, Tammy. And I know you talked about nagging and policing and how that's not a great tactic. But what are some of your recommendations for folks who are living with a partner who is not making behavioral changes that could help them?
Yeah. It's, I wish I had better advice. I don't have very good advice because it really is up to the patient or the person that needs to make the behavior change. It's their body and it's their decision. What I remind the patient and the partner is that the partner is the biggest stakeholder in the patient's well-being, right? In the patient's health. The partner is the biggest stakeholder. They have almost as much, there's almost as much implication for the partner as there is for the patient. So they're a stakeholder, and I think their voice should be heard, but I don't really have advice for how to make it happen because I think you can't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes there are things that are just outside of your control.
I
And
think, I'm sorry, Cassie, I think you can say, um, your heart attack really scared me, and I want to help you make these changes. Is there any way that you can suggest that I can help you? Or I don't see you making the changes you promised the doctor, and that really worries me. This is really important to me. So you can put it out there. It is the patient's decision, and sometimes there are consequences for it. So let's take, I don't know, I can't sit by and watch you ruin your eat like you've always eaten. I'm sorry, but
yeah, yeah, definitely. There's some the clear communication that you talked about definitely is so important for a number of these tough conversations. Um, and Tammy, I'm wondering, I know you work with the Family Institute, and when do you recommend folks reach out for couples therapy? Is there a way for folks on our call today to know if that's something that could be a good resource for them?
Mhm. It is when your typical coping strategies aren't working. Your typical ways of communicating, your typical ways of self-care, your typical ways of understanding what's happening, I would say is, and they will, is they start to break down, that's probably the best time to call. You know this sometimes because all of a sudden you're going along just fine and all of a sudden you feel overwhelmed, or all of a sudden you feel like I can't take one more day of this. Or you realize we've never really fought that much and now we're fighting a ton and I don't know what to do. So I would say as your coping strategies are failing you, that's the time to ask for help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's really helpful to kind of know when is a good time to reach out for, professional help. And another question that's coming up is around talking with other people who are going through something similar. There might be a stigma around living with a disease, maybe for, depending on what age these folks are at, maybe younger couples aren't talking to people about it, so they don't know that their friends are going through something similar. Do you have any thoughts on resources for couples to talk to other folks who are going through something similar?
Yeah, what to say to someone else going through that? That's a hard one because everybody is different. I
Hmm.
think letting people know that not only are you there on the diagnosis, but you're in this for the long term with them. You're in it with the patient, you're in it for the partner. And the only way to remind each of them about that is continuing to check in because people tend to get a lot of care and concern and a lot of offers for help when they're first diagnosed or when they're at their most sick. But they don't as they start to get better or they're not at their most sick yet. So I think to continue to check in, to continue to offer support in lots of different ways. How about if my husband comes over and sits with your husband and we just go get a bite to eat, or um, or I'm going to the grocery store. Can I take you with me? Or can I pick up something for you? Or how about a walk? Can the two of us just go out for a walk together? Or I really miss hanging out with your sick wife. Um, why don't I come over and hang out with them and you take a break? So you can come up with specifics, you can try to guess, you can ask, but I think the most important thing is showing your concern across the long term.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I really appreciate that advice. And now, Tammy, is it okay to, in those communications, is it okay to check in around their illness? Like, I know you're working through this certain disease. How can I help you? Is
Mm-hmm.
that appropriate, or should you tiptoe around that?
Yeah, well, I think you know my default, which is always ask.
Hmm.
So, you know, I know something is going on with Rhonda, and I don't exactly know what it is, but I know it's really taking a lot of your time. I don't want to pry, but I want you to know that I'm there for you, and I'm happy to talk about it at any level. I'm happy to talk about it in vague terms, and I'm happy to talk about it in specific terms. I'm happy to help you do research, or I'm happy just to keep you company.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And at another point throughout the presentation, Tammy, you mentioned being honest with your feelings, and both for the partner and the patient. Um, and is it always important to be honest directly to your partner, or are those are some of those things that you may want to share with a trusted loved one outside of that relationship? Is
Yeah.
that necessary to express that guilt to your partner?
Yeah. No, it's certainly, again, there is so much pressure on the relationship as the world gets small.
Mhm.
So, of course, talk to other people. And I think that's great. I was laughing when you said that because when I see couples, if they preface something by, I just want to be honest, I know some zinger is going to come after that. And that's
Yeah.
not what this is about. So it doesn't give you license to be rude. It doesn't give you license not to care about the other person's feelings. I think you can say anything to anyone. It's how you say it and when you say it.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And Tammy, can you share just a little bit more about the resources through the Family Institute in case anybody is local and may want to learn more about the Family Institute specifically and your
Yeah,
work there?
absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome.
So the Family Institute is really an institution in Chicago. We've been around for about I think 37 years, and we have three different parts to our mission: to educate students, to do research, and to provide clinical care. And in the clinical care, it's for this is what I love about working there. We treat people at the highest income levels in Chicago and people at the lowest. So we have a staff practice and we charge. And some people take insurance and some people don't take insurance. So some people are more expensive than other people. Our senior clinicians tend not to take insurance. Some do, so you never know. But we also see the very poorest people in Chicago. Um, our average cost per session, I think this is right, our average cost per session in our clinic, which is no and low cost, is $7 per session. So I wouldn't want anybody to think that help for this is out of reach.
Mm-hmm.
For people who are out of town, I say this a little bit with hesitation, but we do have the ability to provide teletherapy. We're all getting used to it. We do have a platform for it. We tend not to like it for people we've never seen in person, but in certain situations, it can work. Should know, though, that insurance doesn't cover it,
Mm-hmm.
but it is a possibility.
Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful to know, and it's great to know that that is teletherapy is an option in the future. And
Cassie,
Tammy,
can you, Cassie, can you put on the materials, the handouts, or
Mhm.
something? Can you put on our website so people can go right to it?
Yes, I will chat that out to everybody as we maybe take this one last question, Tammy, before closing out, if that works for you.
Sure.
Great. Judith is writing in, how do you show concern without always forcing the person dealing with their illness to have to focus on their illness? How do you avoid saying, how are you doing?
Oh yeah, that is a great that is a great question. Um, because it is important because you feel different, as I said, throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the illness. So the person needs to get their finger on that pulse, right? They need to know how you're doing. But yes, that question can get old and that question can sound rote and that question can sound impersonal. So I would say try to be more specific about it. Yesterday you had a terrible headache. Is that better today? Or I know the leg cramps are getting worse. Can I rub your legs? Um, or is there anything that you want to talk about today? I've got some time. I'm just going to sit here. Is there anything that you want to talk about? So I would say just vary it with the general versus the specific.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really helpful, Tammy. And you've shared so many really great tips and tangible things that folks can do to work through these challenges, which we really appreciate. And I'd love to give you a few more minutes, Tammy, if you have anything else you'd like to share before we end for the day.
No, I don't think I have anything to share. I really appreciate people's interest in this topic. Just the fact that they signed on to this very, as Cassie, as you were saying, this very niche area
Mhm.
means that people know that there are psychological ramifications of a very physical illness. And to me, that's what's most important.
Hmm. Yeah, and the fact that you are able to share all these great tips with folks going through that on how to deal with it, emotionally and psychologically is just really helpful. And we want to thank you again for sharing all of this great information. And of course, thank you to everyone else who joined the call. If you all have any extra questions, I'll share my email address in the chat box. And I also shared the link to the Family Institute. So you can go there for more information as well. But thank you all for tuning in. You can find the rest of our archived and upcoming presentations at alumni.northwestern.edu/career webinars. We hope you have a great rest of your day and go Cats.
Thanks, everybody.